The next presentation, we have Jessica Argo here. Welcome to Exploratorium. Great that you're here. She is working at the Glasgow School of Art, and she's program leader in sound for moving images. And she will talk about a hybrid piece of the Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra.
Thank you very much. Movement 1, listen. Does the dark focus your attention? Does it allow us to listen more deeply? Perhaps even quantum or multiversal approach to filming improvisation and improvising with film. Film can be a structuring role within the music, or film can explode and implode where and when that music is situated. Essentially, a band can play everything, everywhere, all at once, using telematic digital video conferencing technology and the physical theatre apparatus, sometimes all at once. Before March 2020, the majority of our practice saw us playing as a room orchestra, in physical proximity, in a room. We spread across that room in a circle so that we can anticipate and listen, not just with our ears, but we can listen with our eyes. Curious to each other's musical and physical gestures. Every player is the best seat in the house. We break up the idea of discrete string, wind or brass sections to allow saxophone and theremin, for example, to fuse in unexpected ways, each prizing or drawing out the previously unheard acoustic qualities from the other. Glasgow's Improvisers Orchestra has free improvisation at the core of our practice, but we also explore projecting graphic scores, primarily to distribute our creativity, sometimes to reprioritize a chosen voice or two, sometimes to create pools of focus or build morphologies of change and spotlighting voices. Such as the Delhi-based sound artist Surbi Mittal. Her piece Unbound was a watercolour score with gold scribes to trigger voices and amorphous puddles of blue, purple and green for electronics, to encourage the orchestra to lean into the river Yamuna in Delhi's sense of omniscient time, rather than humans' default linear sense of time. Another is an animated painterly film from the visual artist Mario Rossi, with Jerry Rossi conducting, facilitating, directing a precise time-stamped musical score of text instructions that reference Hollywood and Italian films. Performers can jump and switch musical identities by building new instruments or playing props and DIY contraptions, like the hardware stored tubing flute from Alvin Curran, or an object welded by Raymond MacDonald and co-designed by he and Shamir, an artificial intelligence being. Orchestra members like George Burke can deal out a score on post-it notes, like Improcerto after Harry Beckett, And that sets up a dynamic musical chairs where performers can jump out of their seats to play at being the conductor or play at being the soloist. On Monday, 23rd of March 2020, our Prime Minister instructed us to stay at home to minimise the spread of COVID-19. On Tuesday, 24th of March 2020, Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra was due to play together in a room in Glasgow's Centre for Contemporary Arts, a space a bit like this. So on Tuesday, 24th of March 2020, day 2 of the UK's national lockdown, first national lockdown, Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra decided to play their instruments on Zoom instead. Between Raymond, Tia Denora, Maria Sappho, Robert Burke, Ross Burrell, Una McGlone, and we've each disseminated different research outputs about this, like an article in Frontiers in Psychology, a lecture for the Audio Engineering Society, which is a bit different to this one, an Oxford University Press published book called New Directions in Musical Collaborative Creativity, the Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra and the Theatre of Home. Did you know the writers of that book hadn't actually been in the same physical room for the 4 years they were writing it until it was finished? That was taken 4 years later, that photo. There's also festival commissions across Miami, Japan, Australia, all through the internet, of course. Fast forward, or verse jump, as they did in Everything Ever All at Once. Our lovely John Russell was in the Zooms for the first year of our last 4 years, and wanted to include him there in my little fast forward. No matter if the player's Zoom setup is hi-fi or lo-fi, there's actually no perceived hierarchy of one sound being better than the other. In fact, mobile device dial-ins are actually really remarkable contributions, and they bring about a hybrid way of being, a performing and mode. Like the listen and walk mode of the Walkman effect, Hosokawa 1984. For example, Thomas Rohrer beamed in a stunning rush through all of these vistas in the snow-capped mountains of the Swiss Alps when he was on the train one day. Raymond beamed in a still contemplative broadcast of a sunset and candles in Tuscany, which I couldn't quite believe. Some performers even remixed their visuals in real time along the lines of scratch video pioneers like George Barber and Dara Birnbaum. It's a mouthful. For example, Maria Sappho in the UK, Raymond again, Yasui Yasuhiro and Yusuko Kaneko in Japan, even Ian Burse and Laura Kavanagh of Instant Places in Ottawa in Canada. They were celebrated by the group for their hypnotic, otherworldly transformations using live filter software like CamTwist, if you've used that, or SnapCam, bespoke interactive platforms built with computer code like Pure Data and Max MSP. In the Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra Zoom Telematic performance, I think Maria Sappho is quite like a chameleon or a cuttlefish, because she subverts the live and samples herself. According to Jaron Lanier, a virtual reality pioneer who wrote, "The purpose of VR is to turn humans into cephalopods," he explains, "some of the cephalopods have a marvelous organ called the chromatophore. That is, they essentially display built onto their skin. They can create luminous, quickly changing, colourful images all over their bodies. It's absolutely enthralling to watch them flash each other, seemingly even, communicating in a visual language."
I think something that working telematically has taught me, and also I guess being someone who grew up in the digital age, is that there is this wonderful space in which we might reinvent ourselves and question what is the identity that we're presenting to the world, what are other people seeing, because we can see it in real time, and we can also augment that and utilize the wonders of a digital world to create a fantasy that oftentimes is not possible for us in this physical world. So for me, it's a very empowering space where one can try on other identities, where one can subvert identities that are often perceived of us, So that to me is what the visual aspect meant. I don't know if it maybe made me play less, or if that was the question, but maybe it made me more obsessed with thinking about myself and my identity.
Okay. In Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra Festival 14 and 15, GIOFEST 15, we commissioned Maria Sappho and the Noisebringers to devise hybrid pieceworks. For example, Maria Sappho built the Concerto for Virtualities in Orchestra, where she was a conductor who harmonized the voices from human and more than human entities. A Zoom orchestra, a room orchestra, mushrooms, Chimère, the artificial intelligence being, and Yasuko Kaneko, who was so prolifically on all of our Zoom calls from Japan, but then welcomed into the room orchestra for that festival. So she was on Zoom and then stepped out onto stage, and it was quite a magical moment. For the Noisebringers, they built a score called Futrak. This was a dense, political, ambitious work, devising interplay between the Zoom orchestra, the room orchestra, augmented reality, a time-directed social score, and that's enough, isn't it? The last piece I composed for Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra back in 2022 was called Folding Space, Folding Time. It was a vehicle for me to share an auto-ethnographic diaristic poetry that told stories about the experience of distance and immersion in a rural country in the Tasmanian Highlands, of forming a community with Australian Art Orchestra that twinned or mirrored my own in Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra. The work itself consisted of a densely time-stamped text score for the room orchestra, no Zoom orchestra, sections of pre-recorded voiceover and archival film and animations periodically lit up what was mostly a black screen. There was a spotlit duet. There was a theremin solo played by two performers, which actually had visually transmitted performance gestures, as if a conductor's hand, but was actually operating the theremin through my visual interpretation. There was also a lighting design at one point to simulate an orchestra that played sleep and then an orchestra that played awake states. For the hybrid piece this year, 2024, I wanted to play with the idea that a score could be merely a container to make room for the performer's compositional choices. Akin to the idea that an MP3 file, an MP3 is actually a container that compresses audio. It claims to delete the sounds that humans couldn't perceive anyway. A container that listens for us. According to Jonathan Stern and Ryan Maguire, this does actually fundamentally alter the way that the music sounds. Some of you may find that yourself in your own perceptions. Part of the reason for that is that MP3 was designed using a limited white-centric series of songs to build and calibrate that tool, that container. So maybe not best designed for complex bass structures, for example. Anyway, back to hybrid piece. One of the strengths of the Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra Global Telematic group is that we have a formula that eases our creativity. Every week on Tuesdays for 2 hours, we meet on Zoom. At first, we catch up about our lives, music, the world. Then we have a 20-minute free piece. Then we have spontaneously arising themes or prompts or words or ideas or textures that we play to and explore. Then we have a section where we turn all our cameras off and a couple of us appear every now and then for small groups. Sometimes duets, sometimes trios. I wanted to create a model of this, a replica of this almost, a small scale 20-minute stage hybrid piece with 3 discrete movements. My compositional decision to not play was an enaction of the responsibility, maybe load can be thought of, but I see it as a responsibility, I see it as a privilege, of making space for others to play. To be honest, my decision to not play was also to ensure precision and clarity of intention for the piece. The act of me announcing movements 1, movement 2, movement 3 mirrored my role as recordist in the Zoom sessions, to record the clap to start a piece, akin to the slate on a movie shoot. The work was less about me and my performance virtuosities. Rather, my voice signalled the boundaries of the timestamp as a framing structuring device. My voice was a sounding of the table line boundaries on the written score. My voice was the marker, the container, the get, set, go that the affordances of Zoom technology requires. It was actually a reference to the ironic prompt I sometimes give to students who I'm teaching improvisation for the first time, that weirdly there can be a bit less inhibition or fear and a feeling of freedom that can be granted when you're told to play from a framework of prompts. A freedom from judgment, maybe a sense of ability to act without performance anxiety. For beginner students, I ask them to bring a noise-making object and I hold up text prompts. Tell a few students to play quiet sounds. Tell them what to do. See if they can figure out if a box of rice can make a long sound or not. A 20-minute free improvisation hybrid piece might ironically feel like there's actually less freedom because the orchestra may not be able to listen to each other's distinct grains of Zoom filtering versus room acoustics, reverberance. They might not be able to really fully appreciate or calibrate to each other and to be guided along a structured piece of parsing and building. I was tasked with opening GIOFEST 16 with the hybrid piece. And I thought it would be quite contrary to have the first 8 minutes of the piece with the Zoom orchestra, then the room orchestra. Stratified, separate, not all at once, but one after the other. I chose the Zoom orchestra to appear first due to the inherently cinematic nature. I wanted the audience's attention to be tightly focused and to hear that digital grain and idiosyncrasies of each player's room tones. The Zoom orchestra was soloed. I wanted the piece to emerge out of pitch black, which was quite unusual for GIOFEST. We normally have lovely ambient lighting for a lot of it. Because I wanted to emulate the womb-like darkness of the cinema apparatus, according to Jean-Louis Baudry in 1970. Mark Kerins revised his apparatus theory in 2010 to write that when an audience watches a succession of moving images with a mixed synchronous soundtrack in a darkened space, it encourages a regression to an infantile state. Because essentially we're dampening the prefrontal cortex, the area of our brain that's dedicated to perceiving and focusing and choosing what we listen to and watch. That area is dampened, as almost like when we were babies, when it wasn't quite formed yet. Essentially, if we're given a focused data stream in the dark, our brain doesn't have to scan around an array of competing stimuli. I also wanted to reference Samuel Beckett's very claustrophobic Not I, where the actor's mouth is the only part of the mise-en-scène or staging that's lit up. Everything else is in pitch blackness. They even shut off the fire exit signs. We didn't do that at the CCA, thankfully. Apparently, audiences in those performances almost imagined the mouth was moving across the stage because they couldn't quite cope with that level of sensory deprivation. It became quite hallucinatory. The only camera on the Zoom call at the start was from a laptop in the CCA, pointing to a stage light that was then shut off to start the piece. This signaled to the Zoom orchestra to activate their cameras and unmute their microphones one by one. In that instance, the room orchestra became one with, or fused with, or became the room audience. Okay. I then announced movement 1, respond. So the Zoom orchestra switched off their cameras, the stage lights burst into full brightness, and we heard the full spectrum of room instruments. I wanted a shock of a bright light to emphasize that contrast of what it's like to have a domestic to camera performance versus the bright lights of a public stage, how that physicality changes. That room orchestra were just given one word, respond, to make it overt that the room orchestra are replying to the 4 minutes of the Zoom orchestra they've just heard. through the theatre PA. Perhaps they were mimicking acoustic timbres, mirroring physical gestures seen on screen. Movement 3, duet. I wanted to thank Maggie for her central contributions as she shaped the first years of the Global Zoom Orchestra and the catalysing role that voice and words have in the Zoom Orchestra sessions. I also wanted to thank Constance Cooper because, almost as if in a relay with Maggie, Constance joined our group in the years that Maggie stepped back as she was touring more in the UK in physical room orchestras. On Zoom, we ask around for ideas or themes, often a single word or a phrase that would be like a prompt, like a compressed form of a Fluxus text score, for example, from Yoko Ono, such as the lighting piece, where she prompts you to light a match and watch until it goes out. Often those prompts might arise out of observations of organically occurring gestures, like an improvisation we had on the theme of food. It was inspired by Maggie's performing and cooking multitasking mode. This section literally shone a light and spotlit, not just metaphorically. Maggie was the only one in light there. Spotlit my role models for creativity and care that transcends categorization. Care that transcends time and space barriers. I'm so lucky to have made music, dance, and text with these talented women who never fail to make me laugh, make me cry sometimes, make me think deeply about our relationships with each other, and about care for humans, and about care for more than humans. Constance composed a piece for us called A Piece to Entice Birds, because she was concerned they hadn't returned to her stoop in Washington Heights this spring. Oh, of course, I was honoured to have Dr. Maggie Nichols, who's a profoundly influential, if you don't know her, vocal improviser and founder of the feminist improvising group, and now The Gathering as well in Wales. And Constance Cooper, who is an actor and experimental composer based in New York. I was really honoured to have them both agree to play in this profoundly vulnerable, multi-dimensional centre stages together at once. I also wanted to overtly confront the notion that we are subverting Zoom, which is a teleconferencing tool that was originally built to keep employees working when companies shut down. Capitalist business infrastructure that sprung into popularity and actually made a lot of profit, as you can see, try for free, made a lot of profit during sprung into popularity and made profit virtually overnight and enabled a semblance of business as usual, literally, when we were suffering through multiple global pandemics. There's more I can say about that, but best not to get into a rant. Finally, I announced Movement 3, Free Improvisation with Light Crescendo. The score instructs the CCA Theatre stage lights go from low to mid to full brightness over 7 minutes. The brighter the light, the louder the sound. And the result, when you ask the Zoom orchestra and the room orchestra to crescendo over 7 minutes across continents, it felt as loud as two competing football team audiences, what do you say? Supporters. Felt as loud as the competing roars in a football stadium. There's a lot of that in Glasgow, if you're familiar. And as much as I directed in the rehearsal, we're going to start from the quietest quiet. Oh my, no, it was already pretty loud to start with. So it just became louder and louder. And thank you to Jim McEwen, who mixed the recording and kept that crescendo authentically blasting towards the end. It's available to watch in full on YouTube if you want after. Just a little bit of behind the scenes of planning a hybrid piece in a theatre. It required advanced commitment to the performance, even commissioning an advanced technical run-through way before our festival even started with our audio engineer. He went above and beyond to ensure that the Zoom orchestra and the room orchestra and I felt confident that there wouldn't be embarrassing, uncontrollable feedback or internet connection issues in what can be a really high-pressure, nervous event of the live audience waiting outside the door. And I needed to have the Zoom members on call throughout the day to line check, and that to know that they would have patience and follow instructions to ensure those sections and boundaries and containers and movements were conceptually clear to the audience. The tech, oh my goodness, I won't get too much into that other than the fact that we needed to connect the room orchestra spot microphones into a mixing console along with my compare, composer, conductor microphone that was actually set to be prioritized to cut through all other sound, which was really important to this piece working. Maybe also good to know was that we needed many more laptops than you'd ever think to run this piece. One to run the audio to Zoom, one to run audio from the Zoom to the room, one to beam the Zoom session to the projector theatre screen, one to beam the Zoom session to a TV for the orchestra, the room orchestra to see, one to capture and transmit the image of the stage light, which needed to be off, on, or in gradual light and crescendo, and one to capture the visual of Maggie in the spotlight. So, thanks, Una, for your laptop as well, because my laptop was busy running a cinema screening in a different room in that CCA centre, that art centre, and turns out accidentally hosting and remaining connected to that Zoom orchestra who stayed as an after party for the rest of the night when we disconnected them in the theatre. So Constance, Farah, Steve and Douglas Ewart, Steve Beresford and Douglas Ewart, they played and partied together in Minneapolis, New York, London and Cambridge, disconnected from the concert theatre. I'll just briefly explain that every year we do a cinema screening for some highlights from the year's Global Telematic endeavours. So this immediately preceded the hybrid piece concert, a screening of new films produced by and featuring many of the Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra digital global collaborators. It included dance and theatre from Japan and sculpture. So Minori Seki composed this beautiful piece Behind, again in 3 movements, where she scheduled a duet of 2 windows, a dancer and a musician, to perform in a relay. Then she commanded that only the dancers would be on screen and the musicians would be hiding in the pit, the Zoom pit, you could say. And then she shared an amazing 5-minute montage of 1 drawing a day for the last year that was in a rapid animation almost of 365 paintings, which the Zoom Orchestra responded to. You can maybe tell, if you recognise some of the hands, Una, that whilst the Zoom musicians were hiding in the wings. Some of the Zoom musicians couldn't resist becoming dancers. So that's why there's maybe more dancers than you'd expect on screen. Yasuko Kaneko built this beautiful film with handmade origami and strobe lighting for us to perform to. And I like that this accidentally, the quirk of the Zoom recording meant that it looked like the soundtrack. It reminded me of a film reel with the sprocket with the soundtrack on it, and it just so happened to look like that. Finally, some sensory ethnography from Australian sound artists was another highlight as well, as they did an audio description of all of the field recording ambient sounds they could hear out in the Boonwurrung country and Wurundjeri country in Melbourne, Australia. And the Zoom Orchestra, again, responded off camera to that audio description. We also opened the second half of every concert of our festival with a 5-minute extract from a carefully selected, spontaneously arising Geo Telematic Orchestra global film. So a film called Slow, which was a lot about breath and trying to keep one constant tone, very Alvin Lucier almost. That 5-minute piece was played as a prelude to Maggie Nichols's drone-based Pibroch for Palestine. Passport was screened on the night that Serbi Metal's voice boomed through the PA to introduce her Unbound watercolour score. Lines on the Floor, which was a graphic score made of dancers' shoes marks dragging and leaving a residue on a white floor. That was screened before the very dancerly small group sessions on the last night, and it also mirrored the workshop that we did for babies involving a dancer and teaching them how all sounds are made through moving the body, which we were told not to, Eunice, but we were really embracing the moving movement workshop. And why do I have a photo of Tom Hiddleston here? Okay, so this still from Loki. You might remember Loki from Marvel, the Marvel Universe. Loki's own season 2 Disney Plus series. This still here sees Loki quivering in fear at a spaghettification due to the overload of a temporal loom, a result of infinitely expanding branching timelines of the Orwellian Time Variance Authority Institute. I'm guessing none of you will have seen Loki, but it's a pretty niche fan interest from me. Just saw it last week and it became quite relevant because this is actually how I felt when I'm asked to curate an hour's worth of material from nearly 5 years of making music on Zoom together for 2 hours every week. I did the maths and it's hundreds of hours of footage. So how do I make sense of the ever-expanding archive, compressing 1 year into 1 hour? I make a hellish spreadsheet, and luckily we sometimes write notes in the chat, and that saves, and that gives me metadata of each of the sessions. So that's a tip if you're ever going to embark on this kind of sprawling multiversal telematic orchestra. This is what I felt like. I felt like Loki, overwhelmed and quivering in fear at spaghettification, because I wanted to celebrate within the community and showcase out with the community the immense level of creativity, of intimacy that we share as well in our global sessions that are integrated or bound within our everyday or every week. In conclusion, I've given you a backstage pass, a peek behind the curtain of this hybrid piece for Zoom Orchestra and Room Orchestra. Composing a piece that maybe at first seemed like mere stage directions, where I said, you play whatever you want. Now you play in response to that. Now the pre-selected duet will play. Now all of you play whatever you want, as long as you're crescendoing with the light. I wanted to place the Zoom Orchestra first on centre stage, all eyes and ears on them, then ask the Room Orchestra to honour the fact that they launched the festival, as if answering the question that the Zoom Orchestra posed. Yes, and I wanted to spotlight key matriarchal voices in a duet. I wanted to push the Zoom Orchestra and the Room Orchestra to play together, in that sense of children playing together, play nicely, by giving them a shared task, Knowing the room orchestra would be bathed in that crescendo of light brightness. Knowing the Zoom orchestra would merely see the stage light as a small beam standing in for a face on a square on the computer screen. So, therefore, film is a structuring role within our spontaneous music. The quest to produce an unwieldy, expanding archive is motivated by the spotlight. The staging of our physical festival with a theatre audience. And by regularly setting a regular space, a space that's actually made of time, 2 hours every Tuesday, for our global orchestra to perform to camera in diverse spaces and places, it means that we frame and prioritise creativity in our everyday. That's it.
Thank you very much, Jessica,
Thank you.
for this comprehensive lecture of yours. I remember that we also tried to do at Exploratorium a kind of room and Zoom session at the same time, and it was pretty much of a challenge to set this up. So, yeah, amazing how you managed to do this like this. I would say if you have questions for Jessica, maybe later in the break, because we're a little bit late in time. Since you've been mentioning Maggie, there's another exhibition here at the moment at Exploratorium, if you want to call it like this. We have pictures by the painter Doris Kollmann. They are where we have the coffee when you go to the office and the kitchen in this direction. Maggie gave a workshop here at Exploratorium, and Doris has been participating. And from each of the ideas of hers, she painted a picture. So when Maggie was here, she was really amazed also by the paintings. Maybe you want to have a look at it.
That'd be great, thanks. Yeah, Maggie loves the dark as well, so I think that was a bit of an homage to Maggie as well, starting one of the pieces with the dark. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you again, Jessica. And we directly continue with Una McLone.